Okay. Um, Everyone, thank you for joining us today on this beautiful Wednesday. My name is Marcia Simpson. I am Director of Diversity and Inclusion Engagement for Emory Alumni Association. Um, and welcome to our program on the intersections of sexuality, gender, and race. Exactly 1 month ago, Emory University President Gregory L. Fenves issued an announcement sharing Emory Board of Trustees approval of an official land acknowledgement for Emory University. I would like to share that acknowledgement with you all now in recognition of the Muskogee Creek and other Indigenous nations who were displaced in the years before Emory's founding. Emory University acknowledges the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. In 1821, 15 years before Emory's founding, the Muskogee were forced to relinquish this land. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee people from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory seeks to honor the Muskogee Nation and other Indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to respectful stewardship of the land. Thank you so much for allowing me to take that moment. When discussing identity, we often talk about sexuality, gender, and race as separate and individual topics. The focus of the conversation is usually positioned from a place of privilege. However, people are not monoliths. They're not gay or lesbian, or male or female, or white or Black. We must replace or with and. People's identities are full and drawn from a number of intersections. We're also bisexual, transgender, queer, non-binary, Asian, Latina, Native, and so much more. 3 people who I consider friends have joined us today for a rich discussion around the full extension of the LGBTQIAP+ community, its intersection with gender and race, and how these intersections show up in our lived experiences. As always, this presentation is being recorded and will be sent to everyone who registered. Also, please type your questions into the Q&A section of this platform, and we will get to as many as possible. We treat these programs as conversations, so please do not refrain from sharing your questions as they come to you, and we will answer them throughout our time together. For increased comfort, you may also submit your questions anonymously. So now to introduce our friends this afternoon. Dr. Alex Chapman is an assistant professor of African American Studies at Emory University. He received his BA from Washington State University and his MA and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Chapman teaches courses on the anthropology of African diasporic gender and sexuality while centering Black feminism and Black queer studies, as well as courses on Black radical aesthetics and music and performance. Professor Chapman is currently completing a book tentatively titled Project Music, Black Gender and Sexuality in New Orleans Bounce. Bounce music is a form of hip hop that emerged in New Orleans public housing projects in the 1990s. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and mass displacement of Black New Orleans, Black queer performers, often referred to as sissies, and I will say that's uncomfortable for me to say, became prominent performers and recording artists. Project Music investigates the social significance and aesthetic form of bounce music as an expression of Blackness, marked by deviance within socio-historical context of post-Katrina New Orleans and neo-plantation development. He frames the bounce music scene as a social network for the production of Black space and community in a time of crisis. Professor Chapman's research and teaching is aimed at acknowledging the diversity and realities throughout racialized, ethnic, and queer diasporas. As a former professor of women's studies at Spelman College, he held the first appointment dedicated to Black queer studies at a historical Black college or university, and helped fashion the first trans-inclusive admissions policy at an HBCU. Professor Chapman has contributed to numerous transnational, anti-war, and anti-global capitalist campaigns through his performing with the former Seattle-based ensemble, the Infernal Noise Brigade. And I will say that I Googled when I was looking you up and researching you, and you can find those videos of some of those performances. Do yourself a favor. Dr. Chapman, thank you for joining us. Dr. Stu Martell was previously a lecturer at the University of Leeds School of Law and Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the Emory University School of Law. Her writing and teaching is on issues related to reproductive technology, kinship, vulnerability, and queer and feminist legal theory, as well as on questions of gender-based violence and sexual harm. Marvell received her PhD and LLM from Osgoode Hall Law School, as well as an MA in gender analysis for international development from the University of East Anglia. She has held visiting scholar positions at Northeastern University, the Center of Law, Gender and Sexuality at Kent Law School, and the Feminism and Legal Theory Project at Emory Law School, and was a fellow with the Harvard Institute for Global Law and Policy. Previously, Marvell worked as communications liaison at the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, and I don't know if I'm supposed to pronounce that out or if I'm supposed to just spell it out.
UNESCO, that's fine.
Okay, perfect. In South Korea, and served as a gender advisor to the Ministry of Women in the Gambia. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Marvell. Jackie Velez is program coordinator in the Office of LGBT Life. Jackie oversees the Office Safe Space program, supervises federal work study student staff, advises undergraduate student organizations, and supports and organizes major office events. Before Jackie's role in the Office of LGBT Life, Jackie was the program coordinator for LaGuardia Community College, LGBTQIA Safe Space or Safe Zone Hub, where Jackie was able to initiate a safe space program, create the campus's first lavender graduation, and advocate for LGBTQ plus inclusion across city colleges in New York City, and the SUNY LGBTQIA plus Service Council. Jackie's academic career began at LaGuardia Community College before transferring and earning a bachelor's degree in arts and creative writing from Emory University in 2018. As a recent addition to the team, Jackie would like to extend a big welcome to any folks at Emory who are looking for support, kindness, and laughter. Jackie states, "I'm always eager to hear about the hobbies you love, the music you're listening to, and the idea you're pondering. So feel free to send me an email or stop by the office to chat." Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Jackie. In order to ensure that we're all beginning from the same place of understanding, Jackie will first walk us through a brief overview of the gender unicorn and the LGBTQ IA plus acronym. And for everyone who's viewing right now, we will not go into great detail. However, I will be sending these resources out to everyone in our follow-up messaging. Jackie?
Thank you, Marche. Hey, everyone. So happy to be here. Really excited to make sure that we are all on the same page and feel prepared to have this conversation today. So as Marche mentioned, I am going to give just like maybe 1 to 2 sentences on each category. So oftentimes people believe that LGBTQIA+, the acronym, is an identity of itself, but really LGBTQ+, is a combination of different categories, including sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and then sexuality, which is also split into physical attraction, emotional attraction, and romantic attraction, which someone may or may not have the affinity for. So just to give a quick description of each of these categories and what they mean, and helping you identify how these terms are, how they function in the LGBTQ+ community. So for sex assigned at birth, this is a term that refers to the sex that a person, again, is assigned at birth, and or the sex that is recorded on a person's documentation, such as their birth certificate or passport. A person's sex is often based on the appearance of genitalia at birth. However, a person's sex might also be determined by other characteristics such as chromosomes, hormones, and internal anatomy. Previously, and some people still do, refer to sex as biological sex, but this term doesn't fully encompass the complex biological, anatomical, and chromosomal variations that occur in any given person. So the phrase assigned at birth is an opportunity to acknowledge that there is a decision being made at birth. Gender identity, this term refers to how a person sees or feels about their gender. It may or may not be congruent with their assigned sex. So some examples of gender identity include boy, girl, man, woman, trans woman, transgender, gender non-conforming, gender fluid, agender, non-binary, gender queer, and many more. Gender expression is a term that refers to how a person represents their gender through the use of gender cues. For example, a person's gender expression might be connected to how that person dresses or looks, how they behave, or their speech and mannerisms. And then sexuality is a term that is used interchangeably with sexual orientation or sexuality. It refers to the emotional, romantic, and/or sexual desires that one person might have for another person or other people, so plural, or who someone has an affinity for. It also might refer to whether or not a person experiences sexual or romantic desires at all. Some examples of sexuality that we see on our campus are lesbian, bisexual, gay, heterosexual, asexual, aromantic, pansexual, straight, homosexual, and same gender loving. I also want to quickly just go over the word queer, which is also used as an umbrella term. So queer is a word that describes sexual and gender identities other than straight and cisgender folks. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people may all identify with the word queer. So queer is sometimes used to express that sexuality and gender can be complicated, can change over time, and might not fit neatly into either and or other identities. So like male or female, gay or straight. The word queer also has history to it. So it has been in the past used as a derogatory term and maybe still presently in some communities used as a derogatory term to offend and hurt and be violent towards the LGBTQ community. So we're always at the Office of LGBT Life, and personally, we're always mindful of when we're using queer, who's in the room, and how that can make other folks feel isolated or not included or not a part of the conversation. So that is my quick 2-minute description.
Thank you so much for that, Jackie. And so I will stop sharing that. And as I shared, I will send those resources out to everyone at the end of this program. So we will move on to our first question that is for everyone, whoever would like to answer first. I would like to take a moment to talk about pronouns. And I shared before we started our conversation live that we had a discussion about this with a number of parents over this past homecoming weekend. We had an LGBTQ plus tent, and pronouns came up because we were handing out different pronoun pins, and some of them say she, they, or he, they, or they, them, theirs, or all the different buttons or variety of buttons we had. And so as Jackie shared while walking us through the gender unicorn graphic, a person's identity or gender identity, gender expression, and sex assigned at birth won't always align. So why are pronouns such a foreign concept for so many to understand?
Anybody want to start?
Yeah, I can go. I can hop in.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are just worried about messing up, right? I think folks they don't want to offend, they don't want to say something stupid. And if you've never considered the role of pronouns in your own life, it can seem like a really foreign concept, right? So I think education is such an important first step, which is why, Marcia, I really appreciate you organizing today's event and bringing us all together to have this conversation, and to see all these folks that have taken their lunch hours to join us and to think about these questions. So I mean, Jackie, I hope you'll plug this too, but there's great resources on campus. If you're in any way sort of associated with any kind of Emory networks, sign up for the Office of LGBT Life newsletter, right? Go on the website. That clues you into news and events and things happening around campus. You can kind of just get more familiarity with things outside your comfort zone. Take safe space training if you're a staff or your faculty or you're a student. The Office of LGBT Life offers this to give you some more education about some of the language and go deeper into what Jackie was talking about. As you can see, I got a lot of pronouns. I offer a wide and exciting array. And it might be helpful maybe for me to just talk a bit about that, about why I have all these things here. So Alex and I participated on a panel last year to help STEM faculty think about pronoun usage and how to support their LGBTQ students more effectively. And honestly, I've personally been pretty ambivalent about my pronouns for a long time. I didn't really feel like any fit or resonated with me. So I kind of went in the default because she's what I've had my whole life, but that's, you know, I never was like, yes, I do feel like a full and true woman. But then I had to go into a room and talk to a bunch of chemistry and physics and math professors who were genuinely confused about pronouns, right? And they were there because they wanted to do better, and I wanted to help them to do better. And in the Zoom era, folks were already listing their pronouns in a way that hadn't been so explicit before, you know, making it clear what they wanted to be called. And so I decided I would make it explicit too. You know, so I see this list that I have here as like an invitation. You know, you are all warmly welcome to refer to me as she or he or they, or you can like mix it up, mix and match. You know, none of them really fit me still, but I don't feel. But what I want to communicate by putting them all there is my desire to be open and welcoming, right? So when students enter my class, they know that I'm pronoun friendly, right? And that's really important for me because I want them to feel like they can be whatever they want to be in my classes, you know, that there's room for those kinds of experimentations. And I think it's had an impact, you know, like I've had a few students just this last semester come during my office hours to talk about their pronoun relationship or the relationship with pronouns. And I've seen their pronouns change, you know, in our online classes, you know, just a few weeks later. So I think that, and that also is something that ties in with what Jackie was talking about, that things change, right? These pronouns are also they're shifting. People might have like that, their relationships with them might change over time. And what they want to be called can change over time. So again, that spirit of like openness and being welcoming, you know, is just really important because we're all figuring things out. I am old as sin and I'm still figuring things out, you know? So the aim is just to try to do right by each other and, you know, and be flexible, be kind.
Yes, and to piggyback off Stu, I oftentimes think about opening up introductions by identifying myself, not necessarily that I ask that all students have to state their pronouns, because also you have to consider that people who are identify differently might not want to mark themselves within certain spaces. And so, yes, as Stu said, I think of it as an invitation. And I usually identify myself, if people can't already tell, as queer. I have throughout most of my life identified as queer, so more so than gay, because for me that kind of acknowledges the fluidity that I try to embody, and also certain particular political struggles. I think there's a tendency for people to think that queer is always like this very new thing. There have been, or that it's the result of academic discourse or kind of theoretical trends, but there have been activist groups such as like Queer Nation that have been around since like 1990, since a lot of activism around HIV and probably predating that. But also to remain sensitive to the fact that, yes, sometimes that term is used derogatorily, but gay has also, homosexual has also. I think that for when I'm working with communities of color, I always try to, for example, with my own dad, the first time that my dad saw my name in print and it said like Alex Chapman, Black queer scholar, he was like, "Oh, this is bad." He's like, "Oh, I just came to terms with the gay thing." It was like, "Queer, no, that's bad, that's bad." And I had to kind of situate it for him within, in making it clear that it is a political identity also for me. Similarly to Blackness, whereas my dad's parents might not have identified as Black. They oftentimes identified as colored. My dad had a very strong understanding because of his particular historical, political experience of Blackness being a political thing about beauty and about accepting certain aspects of themselves. So oftentimes I'll use that as an example to think about the trajectory from like homosexual to gay to queer. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Just a few things to add. I think some of the reasons, and something that I share in our safe space training, is that I think some of the reason that folks really struggle with pronouns is because folks who are privileged haven't had to think about their pronouns probably since kindergarten, where they were told like, this is the pronoun that you're using. Great, got it, moving on. And I think along with that, like along with having the privilege of not having had to think about your pronouns, I think we really struggle with how to move forward without assumptions. I think we've for so long been able to just have automatic information by seeing someone and assuming their pronouns. And now that we're asking for almost consent, so asking somebody to share their pronouns and then be seen as how seeing them how they want to be seen is something that folks really struggle with. Because it's asking for a lot more work than just assuming right off the bat. And I think that's really the struggle that folks have, is challenging their own assumptions, especially on the fly. So I think one of the recommendations I have is doing some of this work, this reflection on your own time, so that when you encounter someone who doesn't have the pronouns that you expect, it's not such a surprise.
I also
Go ahead, Alex.
oh, sorry about that. I also just think it's about oftentimes people just think, oh, it's too much work, but you would want people to respect. I mean, particularly for communities of color, many of us have histories of not having our gender respected. When we think of Sojourner Truth saying things like, "Hey, I am a woman," that you would hope that people respect and identify you the way that you choose to be identified. It's no different.
I will say that I appreciate this, and if I'm already thinking about like, how can I just like take this one snippet of the program already and like put it somewhere so we can talk about like a conversation, just a program on pronouns, because I will say that this is the most clear that it has been made available. And from different perspectives, I heard different things from each of you that I'm just like, to Jackie's point that you said, you know, people have to challenge their assumptions in order to think about someone's pronoun. And it's not something that you've ever had to think about since kindergarten. I hadn't thought about it those ways. And so I really, truly appreciate that. And I will be sending that clip and saying, I don't know how our marketing team can use it, but it needs to be somewhere. So thank you for that. This next question is for Stu. And you spoke to this a little bit earlier in your answer, but why is it so difficult for people to understand non-binary and gender non-conforming identities?
Yeah, thank you for that, Marcia. I mean, that's a question that I approach, I think, with a lot of compassion. You know, like our world is bewildering, right? That we've got so much information thrown at us all the time. You know, do this, don't do that. Buy this, don't buy that. Believe this. If you believe this, you're an idiot. You know, so people, I think, have a desire for simplicity, which I understand, right? So what could be more simple, more self-evident, you know, apparently than the gender binary, right? Men are men and women are women. What could be more obvious, right? Even trans folks can fit into this binary, right? Trans men are men and trans women are women. So there's a way in which it can all, I think, like affirm the clarity, you know, that the sort of the permanence of the gender binary. But I think it's really important to understand, and this is what I tell my students, that it's just this moment in history, right? In this place that has been colonized brutally by English and French and Spanish sailors that brought their laws and their customs and their theologies with them, that we view the gender binary as being so fixed and so inevitable, right? So you just like scratch the surface of history and you find hundreds, like hundreds, my friends, of examples of cultures and times and places that didn't view gender as a rigid divide, right? So South Asia, I mean, I don't want to do a laundry list, but like, I'll do a laundry list. South Asia, Madagascar, Nepal, India, Indonesia, the Congo, Uganda, Thailand, Torres Strait, Pacific Islanders. You know, like there's so many places that have a long history of gender variant people. Some were celebrated, some were denigrated, or I'm not saying this is all like sweet roses in the historical record, but it was always there, right? That was always, it's that those forms of difference have always existed. Some folks may have heard the term two-spirit. I noticed that LGBTQI didn't have the 2S on it. Sometimes it does, and certainly within Canadian queer communities. And that's where what we call today Canada is where I'm from. So two-spirited has been used by some Indigenous folks to refer to a term or a person that identifies with having both a masculine and a feminine spirit. It's a pretty recent term, but it's been taken up by again, some Indigenous people to describe their sexual or spiritual or gender identity outside of these Western binaries. And really importantly, it reflects these long-standing pre-colonial, right, pre-existing traditions that recognized that people have both, or some people have both masculine and feminine traits, right? And not only does it recognize that, but in fact, two-spirited people are often understood as being gifted, as being like a channel between the physical and the spiritual worlds. And these traditions are now being unearthed and remembered as part of movements for Indigenous sovereignty and decolonization. And then this is really important, Black and Indigenous scholars now are actually, well, some Black and Indigenous scholars now are arguing that the gender binary itself, right, that the imposition of that structure was actually a key element of European colonization, right? So it's by trying to force everybody into these neat boxes of male and female, with the men in charge, of course, that Europeans instated their system of white supremacy and of patriarchal rule that we're still living in the wake of today, right? So like that's a lot. So that's like 500 years of potted gender history. But all of us to say, right, is that the gender binary may seem self-evident, it may seem natural to a lot of people today in America in 2021, but it hasn't been that way for a lot of people, to a lot of places all throughout history. So that was a long answer.
Oh, I mean, it's a good answer, and I think that it provided a lot more insight. And I mean, that's what this program is for. So as long as you would like to go, feel free. Our next question actually goes to Alex and Jackie. And it's that it seems Black and Brown communities have even more difficulty with this acceptance as far as non-binary and gender non-conforming, as Alex, you shared in your story with your dad being like using the identity of queer. What are your thoughts as to why there's so much difficulty with these Black and Brown communities accepting non-binary and gender non-conforming as identities?
You like to start, Jackie? Me? Okay. Well, in some ways, I challenge the idea that it's more difficult for Black and Brown communities. I think that if we look throughout history, if we look at things like the Harlem Renaissance, if we look at places like New Orleans, there is a very, very long history of intersectionality and anti-assimilation within the margins, within racial margins, and also a history of white and other kind of privileged communities going into those communities in order to express themselves. So I challenge that in some ways. But I also think that it is important to always think diasporically and historically about these things. I have a background in anthropology, so I'm always about the social constructs. We have to always get into the social constructedness, not only of race, but of gender, but also that there's this imposition often of just to what Stu was talking about, very Western ideals. If we look diasporically throughout African descendant communities, in the Caribbean, in South America, in Africa, there is such a plethora of gender, sexual, expressions that it makes it very difficult to maintain this idea of the staticness and stability of the gender binary of heterosexuality. I often times in thinking through what Stu was just saying about the imposition of the gender binary, you also have to think about the imposition of heterosexuality, that part of the reason that the Black body was constructed as this incredibly fertile, productive body is by the imposition of heterosexuality on the Black body. Then thus thinking of it as a way of producing more and more property throughout slavery within the context of the US. And so we have to, in some ways, I think that Black communities, we need to really challenge that, because in a lot of ways we need trans and queer activism and thinking to think through the ways that we've accepted ideas about our own bodies through colonialism. So to me, yeah, all of that is, that was a lot right there, but that is a lot of what my teaching tries to get to. And I'm always trying to think through how can we use struggles, thinking about coalitionally, about how these, the reproduction of these binaries and dichotomous logics and hierarchies. So even in thinking about things like trying to speak to older Black communities about things like gender neutral bathrooms, at the end of the day, we all have to go to the bathroom. That's just the most fundamental, essential thing. But oftentimes power and aspects of sociality end up getting regulating those things. So when we think back to Black people's not being able to use bathrooms in public places, I mean, perhaps having to go to a particular like Black versus white bathroom, but in some cases not even having the option, having to just go back in the woods behind a building. I think that people from that era that remember those things actually understand what it's like for gender non-conforming people in the regulation and the criminalization. So if we make those connections between communities and between times, I think it's much easier to have these discussions.
That's such a thorough response. Thank you, Alex. Really helped frame to my response. I think similarly, there is, as a Latina person, Latinx person, I feel similarly that dichotomy of both, there is intrinsically a queer space in Latinidad, right? Like the way that we understand gender expression for femininity and masculinity is all different, while still understanding that there is internalized homophobia, there is machismo present, there is transphobia in Mexico. Specifically, I'm thinking of too, it's all framed from my experience. But I think some of the reason that folks really struggle is both an adoption of whiteness and in this attempt to assimilate, and understanding that I think that there's a sense of queerness being a white thing. And so even with my family, I think me as a queer person in my family, the only queer person in my family, the only out queer person in my family. But the only out queer person in my family, I think there's, and also being first generation in college, I think that also attributes to this elitism that is assumed by being queer and by having conversations about what is our gender, what is my sexuality. Those are very privileged conversations, at least in my family, in Latinidad. And so it seems as though I am whitewashing my community. And with that is also considering that, again, to Stu's point earlier, there's a long history of gender nonconformity in Latinidad, in indigenous communities. And so some of the work is also getting back to this place. Even when I did research in Mexico, I noticed that there was a huge acceptance of queerness right in the center of the city. And even when I went back to my Puebla in Mexico and talked about queerness, my family, who I was very surprised by, was very supportive of queer communities, even though my parents here in the US are not. And I've noticed too, in just the friends that I have, that first generation or like parents that have just migrated to the US really work hard to kind of keep together this idea of heterosexuality, like the patriarchy almost, in an attempt to keep sacred their homeland. Even though their homeland is actually progressing in an attempt to be more inclusive of the people that are there. So I think there is this divide where my parents haven't been to Mexico or Guatemala in years, but are still keeping these very oppressive structures close to home because they feel that that will get them closer to home.
Thank you both for those stories too. I will say, Alex, that I hadn't made that connection of even your example about using the restroom, the coalition building, that I had thought about the conversation around gender neutral bathrooms a lot, but it never made it a connection to back when we had Black and white restrooms, or I mean, even when we had just white restrooms and someone had to go back in the woods to relieve themselves. And I just wonder sometimes, how do we make these conversations larger and make that connection for people who don't naturally make them? So that'll be very interesting to see. And hopefully we will continue to see parts of your research on that. Our next question is to Alex. Again, we've seen a change in the ownership of the word queer, as you've shared, over the last decade or so. What used to be a derogatory term aimed at individuals in the LGBTQIA+ community, as Jackie shared, now offers identity for millennials and Gen Z, and even further back, as you've shared. Where did this adoption come from?
I don't know. I think there's lots of different paths and routes. I always have to kind of think of my own experience first, and I as a baby gay, going into my first neighborhoods in college, out of college, I think that when I first encountered gay community, I was very struck by how white the community was, and most in that without having a lot of education around it, I could tell that there were like very discrete spaces, like there's all men in these spaces, or there's all women in these spaces, and the trans people are somewhere else. And that felt unsettling to me and I didn't quite know why, but it didn't necessarily like sit with me. So there were certain types of racial divides, but also just divides that I was uncomfortable with. And I kind of really had to feel my way through spaces. I ended up actually finding my tribe through political organizing. And then I started to meet people who were trans sometimes. I think that 20 years ago, we didn't necessarily have the discourse of cisgender and non-binary. Language is always changing. And I was just learning, and I was making a lot of mistakes early on. I now, I would say that my gender, I also do not generally put my pronouns up. Unless I usually identify myself if people ask. I, over the years, have more increasingly shifted toward an identification of non-binary. That has to do with my feelings in and around gender, but also we always have to think about colonialism, think all these other things. Even for me, thinking about the social constructedness of the individual, that the discourse of individualism as we know it now has a historical specificity. And so for me, sometimes it has to do with the fact that, I mean, I'm a Gemini, so I'm already, but I also see myself as the embodiment of my ancestors. There is all kinds of spiritual energies. Even when I think about my actual anatomical body as not just being one organism, there are all kinds of organisms that I would not be able to be here and live and breathe without. And so that for me is very significant in thinking about who or what I am. I know I have a certain type of way of talking and moving through tangents. I always have to tell students, just trust me, believe me, I'll come back. But so to me, it's just like that we have to have a certain amount of faith and understanding of our own ability to shift and change, and that's okay. And having enough intentionality to sit through that with other people. I, as the mentor for Spelman's queer student group, Aphrodite, for 4 years, I had so many students who were just like, they were coming out with terms. I was like, I don't know no more. Like, I just don't know. Just like sexual, and like lots of things that were new to me. And I mean, yeah, I want to learn more. And I think representation and language is very important. But at the same time, we have to understand that that's not always the same as having conversations about power and in who within all these various intersections just has power and privilege within certain spaces. So we have to maintain that while also trying to have an understanding of how lexicons are shifting and changing. Did I answer the question?
It did.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that. And so Stu, this next question is for you because we've talked about how a lot of what we've talked about is a lot of things coming from assumption and privilege. So when discussing LGBTQIA+ rights, history, and support, gay and lesbian identity along with the white experience are typically at the forefront. How do we widen that spotlight to include additional experiences across the spectrum?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I mean, to some extent, the conversation we're having right now, really shows like how necessarily related, the intersections of identity, are not just overlapping, but are mutually constitutive. So I think, first of all, it's so critical for white people to take responsibility for a role in upholding white supremacy, and to really try to understand the ways in which racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia, again, are not just linked, but like actually support each other, right? That they're all, and have long been part of similar projects of power. And I'm not a historian, I'm doing my best, but I'm a legal scholar. But I think it's so critical to look into the roots of our current system, right? To get a sense of how we ended up here today, right? So we can call it social constructionism, we can call it just getting a damn sense of our history, but it's just like, how is it that we inherited the structures that we're trying to live through and survive in today? So it's something I'm trying to do in my scholarship and in my teaching. My syllabus is full of Black, Indigenous, Asian, African scholars. So I try to bring in and pay guest speakers whenever I can. So by learning myself, by learning with my students, I'm hoping in some small way in my own practice to be widening that spotlight, as you say, Marche. But how to do that on a societal level, I think, is a really different story and a really difficult question. But I do still think that it starts with education. That might be because I'm an educator. With the way they got that hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I really believe in the power of learning, and particularly in unlearning. Right? White people have so much unlearning to do about how white supremacy operates. People of color already know, you live it every day. But white people really, you can talk about privilege, talk about power, but it's like all the kerfuffle that's going on right now about critical race theory, for example. This is an indication of why some of this unlearning is so difficult. White parents are totally freaking out about so-called critical race theory being taught to children, right? And I can only interpret that as a fear of doing this work, right? It's a fear of unlearning, because it is hard and it is scary to do that unlearning. But even harder and scarier is white supremacy, So, I think white people, again, unlearning, that we need to unlearn. I believe that really strongly. So I think that's a critical part of what you're talking about broadly, again, it's on a societal level. But return to your question specifically about the LGBTQ movement and about its sort of the way that sort of narrow gay and lesbian rights agenda has dominated that. I think that, again, the onus is on white queer leaders, white LGBTQ leaders, the people that control the purse strings, right, to do that work, to connect racism and sexism with homophobia and transphobia, and with capitalism too. I think that might be a conversation for a different day, because it's already 12:47. But all those things I think need to be brought into conversation together in the way that we're doing right now. And really trying to show that you can't think about these issues as sort of single individualized silos, that they all do need to be thought together as part of a larger agenda for social justice.
I appreciate that, and I wrote down your what you said about when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I can definitely relate, and I'm happy that we're having this conversation, because even with our alumni network that we have here at Emory with our communities, we've had the conversation, or I've had the conversation around, as far as intra-group dynamics, there's so many people out there who don't have a safe space within the community, that this should not be the community that we also don't show up for each other, right? And so even with the network, back in this year, this time 2 years ago, actually changed their name from Gay and Lesbian Alumni to LGBT plus alumni. And there was a reason that they kept the Q out, because a lot of our members at the time were still remembered queer to be a derogatory term, as we've said in this program. And so it's been interesting to have those conversations with the community and what that looks like, and how do we make space for all experiences. And that was, I mean, that was a 6-month conversation it took to move away from that. And it took a lot of conversations to have around, well, this is my experience, and my experience does not fit into gay or lesbian. It usually encompassed more than one of those things. And so I was happy that that happened finally, but it was just an interesting experience to watch play out in real time, and have those questions about the importance. So I will say that there's a question for Jackie from Sandra Reyes, and it reads, Jackie, what is your opinion on Latina identity and its interconnected relationship with Latino patriarchy? How this affects how Latina express themselves?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Yes, Sandra, thank you for your question. I think it's so connected. I think it's so wrapped into each other. I've been thinking about this question while Stu was responding, and I think it starts immediately, right? Like I thinking about my memories of as a child. I remember everything I did was tied to pleasing a man in every sense of the word. Like if I did my bed, my mom would be like, do your bed. Because if not, when you grow up, you won't know how to clean a house, and no man will ever love you. And it was for everything. It was like, if you don't brush your teeth, no man will ever love you. And so I think even from a very young child, everything I did was to get the approval of a man. And I think that comes up a lot when we think about the male gaze, and which is a conversation that I know is happening on the ground with like millennials and Gen Z folks, talking about like how we are now trying to operate from a place of, what do you want to see? Like, what does it mean for you to fulfill your own desires, your own perceptions of yourself, and how you want to be seen in the world? So I think my hope for Latinas is that they start seeing themselves as valuable. So like, do your bed because it's going to be really nice for you to have a clean bed in the morning or when you get back from work, and finding a way to like reconnect to the self and making the self happy. Because otherwise it does feel like everything you do is in service of your family, of the patriarchy. And I think the family in many ways is a placeholder for the patriarchy as well, because when the people in the family are serving men, serving the family is also serving men, and serving this like larger idea of peace and calm. You're like, I'm going to forfeit myself so that we have a calm household, not realizing that like you're causing internal chaos. So you may have a calm house, but you are no longer comfortable in your own skin. So I think that's the relationship there, at least for me.
I will say I cannot wait to watch the recording of this and to like really sit down and take all the notes. I do want to be mindful of time, and so I will ask just one more question, and I will ask that all of you answer it. And I think that it's really relevant after the conversations that I had with a number of parents, specifically this weekend at homecoming, as they came by the LGBTQ plus tent. So college often provides young people the time and physical space to explore their identity. Sometimes for some people, it's the first time they're able to do that freely. But we hear from students of color in the LGBTQIA space, I mean, and a lot of students, I would say just all students, not just students of color, that their support systems are small, or their perceived support systems are small. For those of us who have loved ones who have come out to us, or that we have an inkling that they haven't come out yet and want to, how do we support them?
I think just listening is the first step without having to react. I recently had a family member come out to me, and it was really exciting for me. But oftentimes people just really need someone to talk to, and I think that sometimes there's a tendency to want to empathize so much that you can kind of silence someone else, but just letting people get it out and encouraging and finding places where people can express themselves, flourish, and experiment. I think that that's really what kind of coalition is really about. And it doesn't always happen where you think it's going to happen. I think that for one, we haven't really talked about just multicultural discourse, and there's so many organizations that really don't have a sincere investment. They're just trying to meet quotas and whatnot. But you can kind of tell the difference between sincere shifts and change, contingent on the distribution of power and who has a voice. And so being aware of those things, but most of all, just being able to listen and actively listen without having to assert your own narrative.
I think, and to that end also, realizing that we're all going to make mistakes, right? Nobody knows everything. Everyone's bound to mess up sometimes. But I think it's better to try to be generous and understanding and supportive and mess up than not to try at all. I mean, again, I think people are really held back by fear of again, sounding stupid or making mistakes, or or even hurting somebody else. So even if you misgender someone, and that's I misgender people still today, right? I'm doing my best. I'm trying to learn, but I always make mistakes. You correct yourself, right? You stop, you correct yourself, and then you keep going, right? So it's at least I hope it is. I understand this as being respectful and transparent. It signals that you're willing to be uncomfortable, right? That you want to take ownership of your errors, right? You want to try to do better. So, those just the recognitions that we are different, that we're going to have to meet in different spaces, and it might always not be comfortable for you or for the speaker, but you're willing to make an effort to meet people where they are. Also, not asking that, say it's a loved one that comes out to you, not asking them to educate you about what that is like for them. Go on YouTube, right? There's plenty of resources out there, right? There's lots of different ways that you can, train yourself, get more information without asking that person to be the spokesman for the entire, something that they're probably just coming to grips with themselves as somebody who's just coming out, right? So don't add more burden on that. I've actually had people ask me to talk to their loved ones that are coming out, right? When my law professors approached me, it was like, could you talk to my 12-year-old child? I'm not sure exactly what's going on with their gender, but I'm pretty sure that that's not what the one we gave to them at birth, and so I was happy to, so I took the kid out for lunch and we walked around in the park and, and just finding ways to be supportive and to show that loved one that you understand that they're going through something big. You might not be able to fix it or respond to it or have all the answers, but you're going to do your best to try to get those answers, give them the resources they need, and be loving, that you're there to be supportive.
The last thing I want to share, I think, is it's important to also just support folks being uncertain about their identities, and not expecting folks to come to you fully fleshed with all the answers and a full brochure on what they've discovered about themselves. Allowing space for students and really anyone, your loved one, to say I actually really don't know what's going on, but I just need to know that I have your support when I do figure it out, and that you're not pressuring me to also come up with a label immediately. Because I think sometimes we often do that. We're like, well, then what are you? What do I say to people? How do you want to be referred to? And that just may be overwhelming because you don't have that yet. How could you? Right? So I think that's important.
I would just say one last thing. Also shut shit down, right? If people are being homophobic, transphobic, racist, if there's ways in which people are actively, casually, very often, just spouting discriminatory bullshit, shut it down. Just be like, this is not okay. You know, like that's not acceptable. That's rude. It's disrespectful. There's no place for that here. You know, so modeling that even when your loved one or, you know, the person's not around, that also helps to create an environment that is, you know, safe, you know, that person will be able to thrive in.
I think that we should end there. I appreciate that last bit of insight, Stu, because I will say I will say that you inspired me through our conversation to, I realized my sister is a lesbian. I didn't realize she was a lesbian. She came out like 17 years ago and she was in high school. And I knew, but like you said, allowing her that space to navigate. And I had never asked her pronouns, but I was like, she identifies as a female. She's a lesbian and but she's dresses in a masculine manner. And she presents very masculine. And she actually this weekend cut off all her hair, like actually shorter than Alex's. And so she felt this freedom, right? And I said, I never asked you, do you identify as female? And she's like, yeah, why wouldn't I? She's like, I just like this clothing and I like the aesthetic of it. But I never in 17 years had asked her that, like after she came out. And I think that she had to navigate that herself. I don't know that she'd be able to tell me that when she was 15 coming out, but as of now, she is able to. So yeah, I really do appreciate you all's time. We're right at the 1 o'clock hour. For anyone who is still with us, this recording will be shared out in the next couple of days. And we'll also provide you with the resources that we talked about. Again, thank you all for joining us. And as Stu and Alex and Jackie have said, please continue to support your communities and figure out how you can support the community without empathizing so much that you push people into silence. And as Stu said, and shut that shit down when you see bad things happening. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Marche.
Yes, thank you, Marche.
Thank you all for saying
Yeah.
yes. Have a great rest of your week.
Okay, bye-bye.